The front door closed with a click like a verdict, and for a heartbeat, the foyer held only the sound of Elena Romano's uneven breathing, the perfume of lemon oil tangled with the acrid sting of gunpowder on her coat. Sophia stood frozen on the mosaic tiles, broom handle slack in her hand, eyes wide enough to hold the whole night. Matteo stepped inside behind his mother without a word, his silhouette a shadow that swallowed light. He watched Elena the way a man watches an enemy who once promised safety. Elena's fingers trembled against the banister. She met Matteo's gaze, and, in that frozen room between a life of command and a life of secrets, her voice fell apart. "Matteo," she said, very small. "I had to see him." Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Sophia's knees felt as if someone had taken the marrow out of them. She had seen Elena move through the house like a tide for as long as she could remember, smoothing the silk throws, rearranging the photographs so the light hit Matteo's face the way she liked, tucking small envelopes of money into the heels of the pantry cupboard for favors that paid debts with silence. Sophia had learned to go invisible where Elena was present. The older woman required a kind of deference that came easy in a household ruled by fear and reverence. Yet tonight, Elena's hands betrayed her, ringing and unringing a cigarette case that had long ago been emptied of smoke. "Don't say a word," Sophia whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, because words could build a scaffold for a fall. Matteo remained still, a statue carved from winters and closed doors. He took off his coat, slowly, methodically, the movements of a man who trusted ritual more than conversation, and hung it on the carved rack near the door. The house exhaled. The air smelled like lemons and old grief. Sophia had scrubbed blood from these floorboards when rival crews came hungry and left pieces of their pride behind. She had ironed the creases out of the boss's suits while pretending not to notice how his hands tremble sometimes before he went out to give orders. She had learned the weight of things unspoken, the way silence kept the family intact, the way silence could be bought and sold. "Elena," Matteo said finally, his voice flat as tile. It was the sound of a caged animal that had been taught not to show its teeth. "At 2 in the morning, you come back smelling of smoke and—" He stopped, a slow incision left in the sentence by something like disbelief. "You had a meeting with Inspector Velasco?" The name landed like a bruise. Inspector Velasco, who wore bullets like cufflinks and had pockets stitched with favors. Velasco, whose appointments meant protection, whose protection had price tags that read in wavering handwriting. Elena swallowed. Her lips were bloodless. "I went to bargain," she said, and the way she used the word made bargaining sound like prayer. "He said he could keep us safe. He said he could keep—" Her eyes flicked to Sophia, pleading for a face that would understand the impossible math of mothers and sons. "Him safe." Matteo laughed then, a sound that was thin and brittle and not a laugh at all. "You made a deal with a cop?" It was accusation and astonishment braided together. "You, Elena, my mother? You swore you would never?" "Matteo." Elena's voice dropped into the kind, soft place she saved for when a child needed calming. She stepped toward him, palms out as if to lay down a weapon. "Listen, I did it because I had to. Listen to me." Sophia watched the two of them. This was the Romano house, where power was measured in square footage and the quiet nod of loyal men. Yet here, in the foyer with the grandfather clock ticking slow as a heart, power smelled of perfumed desperation. Mateo's jaw clenched until the muscle knotted. "What did you promise him? What did you give him?" he demanded. There was a line in his voice she had only heard once before, the day he'd ordered a man taken away for crossing a boundary that wasn't even visible on a map, the line that meant someone might not come back. Elena's eyes filled with a kind of terrible calm. "I told him I would give him information," she answered. "Small things, times, names, safe houses, nothing of consequence to you." She made a face as though she were tasting a bad memory. "But not for the police files, Mateo, for something else, for peace." "For peace?" Mateo's laugh was a softer blade now. "You made a deal for peace with a lieutenant who only knows one kind of peace, cages. What are you hiding under the name peace?" Sophia's throat constricted. She had been an orphan at 8, taken in like an asset, hands for the house, ears for the machine. She could count on fingers the moments when Elena had taken her by the wrist and folded her into a hug, the way a woman who had never had a daughter sometimes borrowed one. Those moments were cheap sunrises in a night that stretched too long. Elena had given Sophia kisses on the scalp when she couldn't sleep, left coins in her uniform pocket when pay had been thin. Elena had, in the private hours, taught Sophia to iron a collar until it looked like armor. It wasn't gratitude, it was the way loyalty was cultivated in a place where families long ago turned profit into the only thing that mattered. "Please," Elena whispered, and the plea was a small animal in a place of wolves. "Please try to understand." Mateo moved closer, and Elena's shoulders folded under something heavier than reproach. She had always known how to manage him, how to smooth his nap of rage with soft words and stronger whines. But tonight she was worn thin, seams showing. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper, edges worn and corners softened by many rounds of being smoothed between fingers. She extended it to Mateo as if offering him an apology. "Read it," she said. "Read him." Her voice broke on the last syllable, and Sophia felt the room tilt. Mateo did not take the paper. Instead, he looked at Sophia, and that look made her small. It placed her where she had always been, the one who knew too much and refused to breathe. "Where were you?" he asked, not accusatory, but precise, like a surgeon probing. "Why did you not stop her?" Sophia swallowed. Her mouth was dry. She had been sweeping the back corridor when the car rolled into the alley. She had seen Elena step out, correct and composed, and fold herself into a posture of confidence. She had seen the car's taillights disappear and later watched the silhouette return, lighter somehow. Sophia had wanted to stop her because it would have been simplest, a murmur in the hallway, a single word of warning, but she had also understood that some boundaries were not hers to guard. You did not interfere in the wounds of those who carried scars of command. You survived by stepping aside. "I didn't know," Sophia said, voice thin as glass. "I didn't know she was meeting him for this." Mateo's stare was a law, and the law wanted names. "You were there," he said. "You saw her leave. You were the one who opened the door when she returned. Tell me the truth, Sophia." She did not lie, though for a second she considered it. The house would take any crack and widen it into ruin. So she told the truth the way one spits out a tooth, quick and painful. "I was sweeping the back hallway," she said. "I saw her leave, yes, but I didn't follow. I thought it was a loan, or a meeting about the bakery she wanted to help fund." "I didn't know." Elena stepped forward in a sudden burst of maternal ferocity, as though protective instinct could be summoned and be a shield. "She's telling you the truth, Mateo," Elena said. "Sophia is a child of fortune and misfortune both. She does not move unless I ask her to." The word child was a blade that cut both ways. Mateo's expression softened for an almost human beat. Then it closed again. "You have been meeting Velasco," he said. He's not a man to bargain with. He keeps tabs. Elena's hands trembled. Not for myself, she insisted. For him. The pronoun snagged in the air like a confession. He is back in the city. The house contracted around that revelation. Sophia felt it, a suture rip under pressure. Mateo's pupils narrowed so quickly she thought he was seeing the past reel across the black. Who? He asked, the single syllable loaded like a gun. Elena took a breath, and when she spoke, the words came out as if she had been carrying them like secrets buried in her ribs. The son I lost, she whispered. The one I thought was dead. Her voice was gone almost before it began, and Sophia saw how Elena's face had become an old map of regret. I thought he died that night. I was told he was dead. But he lives. He is alive, and he is a rival, Mateo finished for her, cold as an axe. The house tilted on an axis where loyalty and betrayal were traded like currency. You've been feeding a lieutenant to protect a man who will one day own what's ours, who will take my streets, my men, my life. No, Elena said, shaking her head until her hair fell around her like a veil. I didn't. I am not protecting him for what he will take. I am protecting him because I am his mother. The words landed with the force of an explosion in a room that had learned to muffle sound. Sophia felt the floor slide. The mother of the capo had built an altar of secrets beneath the roof and now confessed to tending a light for an enemy. The rules that had governed the house like iron began to shimmer. Mateo's breath came out sharp. In the distance, a car alarm barked like an animal disturbed. Sophia's world contracted to the three of them in the foyer, a capo who had never allowed a soft place in his life, a mother who had kept a secret like a live thing, and a maid who had never been meant to hold anything of consequence. The dilemma that closed the act like a door set askew was simple and clean and cruel. If Elena's son returned to claim what Mateo had built, would Mateo allow blood to trump code? And more instantly terrifying to Sophia, if the truth came out, whose name would the house sacrifice first to keep the rest alive? The clock ticked on, indifferent. Outside, the city breathed. Sirens, far-off laughter, engines. Inside, something older than any of their loyalties pulsed, urgent and unmanageable. Sophia's fingers tightened on the broom handle until her knuckles whitened. Her life had been one of following instructions, of staying small. But secrets had a way of shifting weight, and a secret like a misplaced child could topple an empire. Elena looked at Mateo, then at Sophia, the two pillars of a life she had helped build, and her next breath was a declaration and a surrender all at once. I will not lie, she said. I will tell you everything, but you must promise you won't kill him until you hear why I did what I did. Her eyes, older than the rest of her face, were the imploring eyes of a woman asking for mercy she had no right to expect. Mateo's face was an unreadable ledger for a long moment. Then he turned away, the gesture like a closing of accounts, and the house felt smaller by degrees. Tomorrow, he said, tomorrow we speak in the office. No one leaves. No one speaks to Velasco. If he comes, he dies. That is the law. His voice held the weight of a crown that had been reclaimed. Sophia walked to the pantry and buried her hands in a sack of flour to steady them. Flour dusted her nails like a promise of another life, one where she might bake bread instead of secrets. But the smell of lemon and gunpowder clung to the air, stubborn as truth. Outside the manor, the city moved on, indifferent. Inside, the line between mother and enemy had been redrawn, and everyone would have to decide which side of it they stood. It was, Sophia realized, with a clarity that prickled her skin, the first time in her life she would have to choose. Sophia woke before the sun, not because sleep had fled her, but because the house itself had become a thing that could not be trusted to keep its mouth shut. She lay in the narrow servants' room above the kitchen and listened to the manor settle. Doors contracting like lungs, the pipes whispering secrets. A distant radio in a neighbor's window tuned to a station that never played anything soft. Every small sound read like an ineffable code. The children's portion of the city stirring, the clack of shoes on cobbles, a delivery truck backing up somewhere on the street below. In the thin hour before dawn, the Romano house felt like a body under anesthesia, the scalpel of truth still warm in its bones. She dressed slow, each movement a small rehearsal for the day she suddenly feared might unravel everything she had been taught to hold. In the pantry, the flower still lay where she had gripped it last night, a white stain on her palm like a memory she could not wash away. She breathed in lemon and gunpowder as if the scents might give her courage. The broom in the corner seemed heavier, the handle an old companion that had helped her steady more than dust. It had steadied nerves, wiped away evidence, softened the path for men who could not afford tenderness. Sophia had never been paid enough to carry the weight of a family's sins. She had simply been paid to keep them tidy. Downstairs, Elena moved as though the night's confession had taken something out of her. Some kind of armor had been peeled away and left hanging rusty on a nail. She was quieter than Sophia had ever seen her, avoiding mirrors, touching photographs only to turn them so they faced the wall. She busied herself with meaningless tasks, the silver, the curtains, precisely because movement disguised the tremor in her hands. When she passed Sophia in the kitchen, their eyes caught and Elena's mouth opened, searching for a way to speak, but stopping short as if some part of her knew the prison of words Matteo had made. "You will keep the hearth lit," Elena murmured, more instruction than plea. Her voice sounded like the thin paper it was wrapped in. "Make the men breakfast like always." Sophia nodded, because nodding was a tradable commodity in the house. But her nod carried the weight of alliances shifting underground. She watched Elena go into the back stairwell and saw her mother's shoulders slacken in a hush that might have been prayer or despair. Sophia wanted to follow, to wrap Elena in her arms and tell her she would carry the secret, that secrets were heavy but not lethal if shared. But there were rules in the Romano house that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with survival. Keep your place, do not be seen, do not be heard. The most treacherous rule Sophia had learned was that silence often meant complicity. She had been silent her whole life, and it had kept her alive. But the silence this morning felt like an expanding bruise. If Elena's son truly existed, if the rumor that a child she had been told was dead was alive and being nurtured somewhere across the city, then their household stood on a knife edge, and any careless breath could topple them all. By mid-morning, there were signs that the city had changed its mood. Men in uniforms walked with a different cadence. They muttered into radios that crackled like static seeds. Velasco's men were a shadow at the edge of the Romano perimeter, always present, rarely seen, like two stitched hands under a table. Matteo's lieutenants were tighter today, their faces sharp as coins. Enzo, Matteo's favored capo and the man who moved Matteo's will into action, watched the staff with a predator's patience. He gave orders that went down like edicts and watched who obeyed without raising their heads. Sophia's work let her see everything but be asked nothing. She set plates on the long table that gathered the family for midday, and she noticed the tremor in Matteo's left hand as he lifted a cup of coffee. No one else did. Power made men invisible to the softer parts of themselves. Matteo sat like a statue suited for earthquake, handsome and broken, his eyes rimmed with red, and the kind of exhaustion that didn't sleep because rest risked loosening control. He spoke as if reciting a prayer, curt and controlled. A list of prohibitions that slid over the room like winter fog. No contact with Velasco. No open business until they found out who knew. No unaccounted movement in or out of the manor. When the men left, they left as a single unit. Doors shut with the polite finality of coffins. Elena remained, and somehow the house seemed to condense to the portion where the two of them paced, an invisible tug-of-war where words were the rope. Sophia wanted to slip into the office, that war room Matteo kept with maps and names pinned like corpses, but she knew that a maid did not enter a capo's private place uninvited. So she moved instead toward the kitchen, where she could watch the comings and goings and find a moment in which to breathe. The kitchen door was half open. Through it she could see the back courtyard where men sometimes exchanged favors and sometimes settled scores. Today, the courtyard was empty, washed in pale light. A part of her was relieved. Another part listened for footsteps she could not afford to hear. That afternoon, when the house had thinned of voices and the sun made glass hearts on the windows, Elena vanished again. Sophia had been folding Matteo's shirts with methodical care, press the collar, tuck the seams, steam the life into him, when she realized Elena was gone. It was an old reflex to notice absence, honed in an orphanage that catalogued who mattered by who was missing at mealtime. Sophia set the shirts down and moved like water toward the back stair. She followed Elena only a few steps before she stopped, because this time Elena did not go downstairs or out the side lane. Elena went to the nursery that no longer hosted a child. The room smelled faintly of baby powder, a memory jar she had left on the shelf for reasons she could not name. Elena sat at the small bed and opened an old trunk. From it she took a folded sweater, moth-eaten at the cuff, the color of storm clouds. She touched the sleeve until her fingers ached and pressed it to her face as if inhaling would summon a sun's breath. Sophia stood in the doorway like a witness summoned too late. She did not clear her throat, she did not speak, she watched and passed the moment into the ledger of her memory. She had been a child who learned to take in the details of those who owned her life. The way Matteo's jaw found rigidity before he punished a man who'd crossed him. The way Elena's hand went for a photograph on a mantel when she needed courage. She had catalogued these things like a library. Now the library burned. "Elena," Sophia said finally, and the name tugged something open in the older woman. Elena looked up as if she had been waiting for the sound of Sophia's voice like an anchor thrown into turbulent water. "You can leave," Elena whispered. "You shouldn't be here." Sophia could have left. It would have been simpler. But she had seen the way Elena's fingers worked the sweater until the thread frayed, and she understood the logic of small mercies. "Why are you protecting him?" she asked, because the question had to be asked by someone who had never owned a family and therefore could ask it without the language of claims. Elena looked like the shape of someone trying to build a bridge out of grief. "Because I am tired," she replied, her voice a small machine. "Because I was told he was dead and I believed it. Because the truth can be softer than the lie, and I made choices. Choices mean debts, but Matteo does not understand the kind of debt I paid." Sophia had once been the kind of small person who can hide under tables and unmake other people's problems. She had no title, no claim, only the knowledge of how people kept their hearts from shattering by hiding compacts under mattresses. "Is he with them?" she asked, meaning the rival crew. "Is he dangerous?" Elena's face folded into something that made Sophia think of old photographs left in attic boxes. "He is a man now," she said, "older than I imagined. He could own the world by tearing it. He has been raised well, in ways you would not understand. They made sure of that." Her breath hitched. "But I swore I would not tell Matteo until I had seen him. I had to know what kind of man he had become. If he is the monster they say, I cannot ask him for mercy. If he is my son, I cannot watch him die." Sophia's hands found the sweater and folded it as if it were a document of treaty. She felt a tug in her chest, a thing that had nothing to do with loyalty to a capo and everything to do with a worn-out human asking for one small reprieve. Her life had taught her many things about which edges to touch, which waters to cross. But it had not taught her how to measure a mother's love or when that love could be a weapon. "Velasco is not simple," Sophia said finally. She had learned the name through the hush of gossip, the way men left crumbs of their fears in her path. "If Elena is bargaining with him, there are conditions." Elena flinched. "He wants things." The admission was iron but soft, a coin pressed into the palm of a beggar. "Protection. Information. He wants proof I am not lying about my son." Sophia imagined the kind of proof Velasco might demand: a photograph, a location, a name. She imagined the price: blood, men, territory. Everything a police lieutenant could use to sharpen his hold on both sides of the law. She had seen those trades from the kitchen window. She had wiped up the consequences. "You could tell Mateo," Sophia said. "You could speak true." Elena laughed once, a brittle sound like glass on tile. "And have him kill the thing I have spent years keeping alive? No, Mateo would not listen. He would make my son into a story for the dead and call it justice." Sophia thought of the man she had seen in the nursery, only as a sweater-shaped absence, and of the way people in power twist moral arithmetic until it suits them. She felt, with an odd clarity, the angle of choice slicing at her own small life. Her place in the house was neat and clean and meant to be unseen. But now the house asked more of her. It wanted her to tip the scales. That evening, when the household gathered under the heavy chandeliers for Mateo's brief and necessary mercy, food that masked hunger, laughter that masked the teeth, Sophia watched the capo across the room like a fixed star. He listened to his men, nodded with disturbing calculation, and then turned his head once in the direction of the nursery, as if testing air. He saw nothing. No one spoke of the night that had cracked their foundations. Conversation moved like a cautious stream. Enzo came to the kitchen on a quiet errand and found Sophia alone folding napkins. He was the kind of man who noticed the smallest things: a soap scum on a tumbler, a hair in the bread, a misaligned stitch. Today, his gaze lingered on Sophia's hands. "You were late last night," he said, more observation than accusation. "Manager says you were on break for longer than you should be." Sophia met him levelly. Lies were a simple tool, and sometimes she used them because survival required construction. "I was sweeping the back lane," she said. "I saw a woman come and go." She kept her voice even. Enzo's face did not change. He favored masks over maps. Enzo's eyes slid sideways like a blade. "Elena?" he asked. Sophia's mouth was a thin line. "Yes," she said. She left. She returned. That was all. Enzo studied her, then nodded as if that were a satisfactory account. But a man like Enzo kept stores of suspicion like a winter pantry, and he filed her answer into a drawer he would open later. "Mateo doesn't like secrets," he said. "Secrecy breeds weakness." The words were not a warning, but a statement of strategy. Sophia felt the pull of their logic as if gravity had shifted. Secrets did breed weakness. Yet sometimes secrets were the only thing able to hold someone together. That was Elena's argument, and now it was Sophia's problem to hold too. The broom in the corner seemed, in that moment, less a tool than a scale. To balance the household's future, she might have to place her whole life on one pan and see if it would tilt in favor of mercy. Late that night, Sophia stood on the external stair and watched Mateo's office window glow like a single star surrounded by darkness. She could hear the murmurs of the city, dogs, distant horns, like the world offering itself up as witness. She did not want to be the kind of person who moved against a capo. She had practiced humility and found it kept her alive. But when Elena had folded that worn sweater and the way her hands shook had given the lie away, something in Sophia's ribs unclenched. She slipped from the stair and moved quietly to the little larder where the house kept envelopes and receipts, the small documents that lubricated a world of favors. There, under a false bottom she had once learned to find as a child hiding from a headmaster, she kept a single sheet of paper, an old list of names she had been asked months ago to keep. Sophia's fingers trembled when she took it out. She had promised never to use it, never to show it, because to show it could mean starting a chain reaction she could not stop. But tonight she thought of Elena in the nursery, of a man who might be slaughtered by the code Matteo worshipped, and she understood that promises made to other people sometimes had to be broken to save what people called soul. She copied one name onto a scrap, only a name, no address, no hint, and slipped it into the pocket of a coat that always hung by the back door. It was a small betrayal and a huge one at the same time. It was a choice that placed her on a different side of the line between the boss and the woman who had given her small kindnesses. She had made a decision to move a secret, to shift the weight of deception from one hand to another. It felt like stealing an egg from the nest of a hawk and hoping the hawk would not notice. Back in her room, she lit a candle and watched the wax melt. The light made a small island of warmth on the table. She thought of Matteo's face when he had said, "tomorrow," in his office. She thought of Elena's plea, "don't kill him until you hear." And she thought of her own life, a string of quiet survival and the sudden burst of defiance that had chosen to speak in the language of paper. In the small cold of her room, clasping her broom like a talisman, Sophia understood that she had crossed into a territory that would not allow her to return. She had placed her hand on the scale of the Romano family and set down something that might, in time, be carved into choices they could never undo. The house slept around her as if nothing had happened, but inside her chest something had shifted, an unseen thing unlatched. When the dawn came, it would find her changed. She had moved into motion without being asked, and the consequences of motion in the world of cartels and captains were seldom forgiving. But action had a sweetness to it, a dangerous, bright smell like ozone before a storm. Sophia realized she no longer wanted to be only the person who cleaned up after other people's storms. She wanted, terrifyingly and fiercely, to be the one who decided when the storm would end. Outside, somewhere in the city that smelled of diesel and pastry ovens and second chances, someone, Elena's son, the answer to years of absence, could be waking with a choice as well. The world narrowed into the point between them, and in that point Sophia had set a wire in place and lit a small, trembling candle. When Matteo would call the morning meeting in his office, when Velasco's shadow might creep closer than comfort allowed, Sophia would have already made a move. She had placed a name into the wild. It was a first push against the tide Matteo had spent a lifetime mastering. She knew not whether it would save or drown them all. But at least, she thought as the candle guttered low, she had stopped being only quiet. The morning meeting in Matteo's office began like an execution. Men filed in, faces schooled into neutral, the air heavy with the perfume of strategy and old bullets. Maps were unrolled with the same tenderness a priest gives a Bible. A cup of coffee steamed untouched at Matteo's elbow, while men reported movements, finances, and small grievances that could be turned into larger obedience. There were plans to shore up borders, to cut off routes, to make invisible things visible. It was business as it had always been, until Matteo's fingers brushed a scrap of paper tucked poorly into the lining of his coat, and everything slid. He had been checking his pockets because he always checked, because paranoia was the religion of the paranoid. And there the scrap was, a single name, precise and clean against the gray of the cloth. The world shrank to the square of that scrap. Mateo's lips thinned. His eyes narrowed until black rims seemed to form. He looked up at the circle of men like a storm forming in countenance. Enzo, who had been giving a report on a road crew, paused mid-sentence. The room held a breath that belonged to those who had been holding it for a long time. "Where did this come from?" Mateo asked, and the weight of the question made the men on the rim of the room look smaller. Enzo's gaze flicked to Sophia, who stood by the doorway with a tray of papers, mostly receipts, and hands that kept time like a metronome. He moved, and the men noticed how composed he seemed, an economy of motion born from winning wars rather than asking questions. Enzo's stare was a compass needle that pointed to a betrayer, and it landed on Sophia with a cruel precision. Sophia's palms went slick. The name in Mateo's hand was the one she had slipped into a pocket at midnight, a small, desperate act to buy a son a few hours more of breath. She had not meant for a capo's morning ritual to uncover it. She had not meant for the simplest rebellion of a maid to be a match lit in a barn. Now 5 pairs of eyes were on her, as if she had walked into the room carrying a smoking gun. "Where did you get that name?" Mateo repeated. His voice might have been calm for anyone else, but it was a calm that came from a volcano. Sophia could feel Elena's presence at the threshold of the doorway like an answering pulse. The older woman had been in the house when the men filed in. She had seen the movement of hands, the alignment of suspicion, and had come to the office like a woman walking toward a guillotine. Elena's face was a palimpsest of guilt and defiance. She moved to Mateo as if to place a hand on a fevered brow, and then stopped, because the laws that governed their lives forbade such soft gestures in public. "It was a slip," Sophia said, voice thin and quick as a snapped thread. I put it in his coat." Mateo's eyes killed compassion. "Whose coat?" he asked. "A coat that hangs by the back door," she answered. "Mine does not—" The lie tried to shape itself, then fell apart of its own exhaustion. She had lied sometimes to survive. This was not one of those times. "It was my doing." The room inhaled again, deeper now. Enzo's jaw tightened, and the other lieutenants shifted like animals sensing a hunter. Mateo turned away from the men, as if the outside world could not touch what now fed the furnace in his chest. He stared at Elena like a man seeing a map of betrayal for the first time. "Elena," he said. It was not a name. It was a verdict. "You trusted her with something like this?" Elena's hands trembled, then steadied with the defiance of a woman who had been carrying a truth too long. "I trusted her to do something necessary," she said. "I trusted her because she has always been—" Her eyes met Sophia's, and for a jagged second their private history flashed across their faces. Lunches shared quietly in the servants' pantry, nights when Elena had smoothed a fevered brow, the small kindnesses that had made Sophia less invisible. "Because she has been reliable." Mateo's laugh this time was an ember, not a flame. "You put our house at risk because you trusted a servant? Because you wanted to protect a man who used our bloodline as a pillow?" He spat the words out as if they were poison. Sophia felt as if the room had become a tilt-a-whirl, and she could not find a place to steady. She had acted alone, driven by a secret sympathy toward a sweater and a wish to keep a mother's prayer alive. She had not known the shape of the avalanche her pebble would set loose. Now the avalanche named her and demanded her account. Enzo stepped forward, an executioner in a velvet jacket. "Mateo," he said softly, "if the boy is indeed the son of Elena, this changes everything." His fingers found the nearest glass and turned it in his palm with a neat, casual menace. "If we have been harboring a seed for our enemy, it is a weakness others will exploit." Mateo's face hardened as if it had been cast in steel. His eyes, for the first time, sought not just justice, but vindication. "If this is true," he said, "then not only has my mother betrayed me, but this house has been compromised. We make one example and then clean the rest." Elena's laugh was small and broken. "You would," she began, reaching to explain, then stopped, because explanation had never swayed Matteo when the code of command was threatened. She had thought her confession might be met with suffering and then forgiveness, a merciful kind of mathematics that rarely existed in Matteo's ledger. But she had miscalculated the ferocity of his need to punish. "You would kill your son to prove a point," Sophia said, and her voice surprised her by how steady it was. It was not a plea for mercy, it was a raw observation. She saw then, stark and geometric, the trade Matteo was offering: blood for control. The house had taught her the formulas of survival, but no one had taught her how to reconcile the arithmetic of maternal love with the calculus of a capo. Matteo's response came like a sentence. "If compromise breeds weakness, we cannot afford weakness," he said. His words were not for Elena alone, they were a law rolled out to the room. "Enzo, find him, bring him to me. If he is what his mother says he is, we will decide his fate in the open. If he is lying, then Elena will answer for every favor she has traded." Elena's face crumpled like paper folded too many times. She reached out for Matteo as if for a lifeline, and then drew her hand back because the man she loved had become a tribunal she could not sway. Tears pooled in her eyes, not dramatic sobs, but those steady leaks of someone who had been building courage from the inside out. "Sophia," Elena said in a voice that had once held both thunder and lullaby, "you did this for me." Sophia's heart lurched. There it was, the other hidden tendon of the house she had not been allowed to name. Elena had been more than the woman who bought her coin here and there. She had been the architect of a small mercy that had given Sophia moments of light in a dark upbringing. The admission made Sophia feel naked and indebted in a way she had never been taught to be. Her loyalty had never been transactional, but now it was being treated like one. Matteo reached for the phone, the finality of his fingers telling the story of a man who would rather obey the ambiguous laws of power than the fragile pleadings of kinship. "Enzo," he said, "you know what to do." Enzo stepped toward the door, and at that movement, the room became a map of fracture lines. Men rearranged their loyalties in the space of a single heartbeat, some toward blood, some toward power, some toward the woman who had fed them in winter. Sophia stood with a broom in her hand as if it were an accusation. Elena looked at her child, not the one in the nursery, but the one across the room whose chest heaved with a choice she had forced him to make, and then turned her face away because the look she wanted to give might be the one that ended everything. As Enzo closed the door behind him, a silence dropped like a guillotine. It was not the silence of a room full of men with common purpose. It was the silence that comes when something beloved has been broken, and everyone knows that the repair will hurt. Matteo stared at the spot where the scrap of paper had been folded, and in his face the map of the future rerouted into unfamiliar territory. He had been a man who believed himself sovereign. Now, for the first time, he had to consider that sovereignty might be bankrupt. Sophia felt the first real break in the house's architecture of silence. It was not merely a crack between mother and son. It was the fissure in the idea of their family itself. Her small betrayal had been a spark. Matteo's decision to hunt and perhaps kill what his mother had tried to protect had become the kindling. She wanted to run to the nursery, to take Elena's hand and beg her to tell a story that would save them from the ledger. Instead, she stood and watched the men leave, as if by watching she could halt the movement they had begun. She realized then a brutal truth. In a world that measured value in territory and names, a maid's attempt at mercy could be misread as an act of war. Outside the office window, the city went on. Buses hissed, pigeons fought for crumbs, a child laughed in the street. Inside, the Romano house was collapsing into a vacuum where trust had been and now was not. Sophia folded her hands until her nails whitened. She had thought she might save a life. Instead, she had started a clock that might stop it. The fractures were not neat. They split along bloodlines and job descriptions, along the thin, unsung loyalties of a woman who had been given a second chance and a man who could not allow soft things into a world that needed steel. Sophia felt the pain of being small in the center of a large, loud world, and understood, with a frightened clarity, that her next move might be the one that either joined the pieces or made them so jagged they could not be mended. She had lit a candle, and the wind had come. Now she had to choose whether to shelter the flame or let it illuminate what must be burned away. The hunt began before the sun had finished rubbing sleep from the city. Enzo moved like a hand made of consequence, calling in favors, turning over men who owed him debts or feared his knife. Men with coats like threats combed the alleys. Phones smelled of static and orders. Matteo stood at the window of his office watching the city he had carved into a shape he understood. In that view, he tried to will the world back into the old geometry where loyalty bent to his will. But the scrap of paper had sung a new song, and the tune had listeners. Sophia did not flee. She thought, absurdly, that if she kept herself where Elena might find her, she could somehow knit the edges back together. She hovered near the kitchen, a small island of quiet hands in a sea of coiled tension. Elena kept to herself like a woman who had been in motion so long she had forgotten how to be still. Her fingers trembled, and she paced the nursery at odd hours, smoothing sheets no child would tuck into, tracing the empty crib as if mapping out a memory. At noon, the phone in Matteo's office cracked like a gunshot, and in the way it did, everyone in the house heard the small mechanical sound as if it were fate calling names. Matteo answered, voice flat as a blade, eyes hard as if the conversation were a wound. Enzo listened at his shoulder like a man ready to prune. When the call ended, Matteo was a man who had been given a map that showed him the place to strike. "He's in the northern quarter," Matteo said without preface. "Velasco confirms. He will be at the warehouse on Via Moretti tonight. If he is Elena's son, he will not know the truth. He will only know what he has been taught, that power is earned with teeth." Enzo's face was animal smooth. "We move at dusk," he said. "We take no chances." Sophia felt the house tilt under that decision. The plan was simple brutality, dressed up as strategy. Surround, take, interrogate. There would be no mercy because mercy had no place in Matteo's ledger. But Elena's plea, "Don't kill him until you hear why," hung in the doorway like a last candle refusing to die. Sophia could see the logic of Matteo's choice. She could also imagine Elena's face at a funeral, the slow burn of a mother's regret that could hollow a man's soul. That night, the Romano convoy moved like a pack, black cars eating up streets, headlights like unbelievers. Sophia found herself standing by the back door with Elena at her shoulder, the two women reduced to shadows in a world where decisions were made with guns and consequences. Elena's hand trembled when she reached for Sophia's. For the first time in a long life of watching the powerful burn their way through the world, Elena asked someone to do something that would not be rewarded with money or protection. "If I tell you to run," Elena said, small as a whispered sin, "you will run. You will go to the bakery in São Paulo and take the passage on the second floor. There's an old friend who owes me. Go there if they turn on us." Sophia's heart hollowed. "I won't leave," she said, though it was not an argument. It was a woman's truth spoken into a place where truth could be expensive. "You must," Elena insisted, "because if I am wrong, you must live." Elena's thumb brushed Sophia's knuckles with a weight that felt like a coin being given for a debt that had no ledger. Sophia swallowed the want to protest and instead kissed the back of Elena's hand, an old blessing they had not allowed each other for years. "For you," she said, a small litany, "not for the house." They went together to the convoy's edge, and Sophia watched the men file out, their faces hard as coins. Matteo moved with a predator's grace, precise, efficient, and cold. He did not look at Elena when he passed her. He had never learned how to hold tenderness in public. He simply nodded once, the single motion of a man who had been taught to keep his mercy private. At the warehouse on Via Moretti, fog curled low like a secret. Men waited like statues whose marble had been warmed by violence. When the rival crew arrived, bodies like shadows spilled from a van. They were young, proud, and armed with the kind of certainty that comes from believing in a cause louder than your fear. A voice called out, sharp, questioning, and the night contracted into the muffled, awful business of guns registering names. Matteo did not begin with bullets. He began with dowels of authority. Lawyers' threats whispered through the teeth of guns, questions that smelled like accusations. The rival Capo's men pushed back with bravado. For a moment, the world balanced on the edge of a knife, and the fragile truce Elena had sought seemed like a dream made of glass. Then Velasco's men stepped from the shadows, and the air shifted. There is a kind of grief that arrives fast. Men with badges who trade in favors, who see law as a currency. Velasco himself appeared like a stain at the door, smug, certain, his presence a confirmation of the bargain Elena had tried to keep. He looked at Matteo with the unrepentant air of a man who had always found rules negotiable. "You found him?" Velasco said, and his eyes slid to Elena like a judge sentencing. "Your son." The word son opened the night like a wound. Heads turned. A young man stepped forward from the rival crew as if someone had called him home by name. He was not the ragged thing Matteo had imagined. He was muscular, eyes clear with the hard polish of someone raised to be dangerous. For a breathless second, Matteo thought of the man Elena had described in the nursery. Then he thought of himself at 20, the way power had already begun to calcify under his ribs. The young man's gaze found Elena and faltered, like a man whose map of the world had just been redrawn. He looked at Matteo as though he expected a grandfather to be present, some kindly figure to offer an embrace. Matteo offered nothing, only a rifle raised like a sovereign's scepter. Sophia could not stand still. She moved before her mind had caught up to the motion, because motion felt like a better prayer than silence. She stepped between Matteo and the young man with a small, ugly courage and shouted, "Stop!" Her voice cracked like a cigarette in the rain. "What are you doing?" Enzo barked. The world around her compressed with men's impatience. Sophia's hands were empty, but her body was full of something she had not known she had. The stubborn refusal to let a human being be turned into proof. "He doesn't know," she said. "You asked Elena to bring him, and you'll make him into proof. You'll make him into a lesson. She begged you to hear him first." Matteo's face shifted in a way that made a sound inside Sophia's ribs break. He looked at Elena, then back at the boy. There was an instant, thin as razor, that passed where Matteo could have chosen the ledger's path and fired. Instead, his hand dropped from the rifle, as if the movement had been arrested by the gravity of something softer he had kept secret, the memory of a woman who had once smoothed the feathered edges of his rage. "Tell me," Matteo said to Elena, the words brittle with command, but undercut with a tremor he could not hide. "Tell me now." Elena stepped forward with a courage she had been hoarding. Her voice did not tremble when she began. It was clear and exact, the voice of someone who had practiced confession for years inside her chest. She spoke the boy's name, the small story of how he had been taken from a street without a name, how she had been told he was dead, how she had been lied to. She told them of the Lascos' promises, of the bargains made to keep a secret alive. The boy listened like a man whose world might be rearranged by facts. When Elena finished, his face crumpled. He had been raised to be hard, but not to be loved by the woman who had carried him inside her. "I am Marco," he said, his voice rough with a life that had been forged in other hands. "I am Elena's son." Matteo's eyes, which had been steel, softened for a small human breath. The world held a pause that would determine how it would end. Matteo could have ordered Marco to be taken away, cleaned from the ledger in a way that would cement his power. He could have done what the code demanded and killed the soft thing to mark himself as unbreakable. Or he could do something else. Sophia watched the play of muscles in Matteo's jaw. The man who had built walls around his heart was suddenly given a choice that would change the architecture of his life. He stepped forward and reached out, not for a gun or for Enzo, but with a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the life it might try to hold. Matteo placed his palm on Marco's shoulder, and in that touch there was a confession of need. He didn't say he forgave Elena. He didn't make a promise he'd keep. He only made a small human gesture, claim without ownership. It was a coat of an offer no one expected. "I will hear him," Matteo said quietly. "Under my roof. No one touches him until I understand." Velasco hissed a protest and stepped toward his men. But the lieutenant knew when a decision had been made and retreated like a shadow. Enzo stood at the edge of the moment, his jaw clenched, waiting for a reason to betray his leader. No one gave it. Sophia felt something in her chest unclench. It was not relief so much as the beginning of a different kind of fear, the fear that a house built on iron might try to harden itself again and snap. But Matteo's hand on Marco's shoulder was a small, impossible act of mercy. Elena's face broke into something like hope and terror braided together. Sophia had wanted to be the one to save a life. She had stepped into the arc of violence with a name in her pocket and a broom as a talisman. The price for that impulse would not be erased overnight. Enzo would watch, Velasco would watch, men would keep lists and stomach grudges. But tonight, for the first time since the scrap of paper was found, the house did not choose slaughter as the first language. As the convoy melted into the fog and the night resumed its ordinary sounds, Elena took Marco's hand like a woman claiming what had been stolen with a prayer in her palm. Matteo watched them from the back of the convoy like a man learning how to see again. He did not look at Sophia until they were in the courtyard of the manor, the lamps casting long human shadows. Then he stepped close in a way that surprised everyone, and his voice, when he spoke, was softer than it ever had been. "You put us at risk," he said to Sophia. "You could have started a war." Sophia braced for punishment. Instead, Matteo reached into his coat and took out the scrap of paper she had dropped months ago, into a pocket, and now saw return to him like a boomerang of consequences. "But you did it for something you believed was right," he continued. "Tell me why." She told him, briefly, simply. The sight of Elena in the nursery, the sweater, the way a mother's hands had betrayed her need. She told him she could not be the instrument of a man's death when she had seen the look in his mother's face. Her words were small. They were not arguments. They were the confession of someone who had learned to weigh the human against the house. Matteo listened with a face that was doing battle with itself. When she finished, he did not punish her. He did not order the usual recompense. Instead, he lifted her chin with a thumb and looked at her as if seeing a map he had never bothered to read. "You are not just a servant," he said, the words like rain on a cracked field. "You are something else. I don't know what yet." Sophia's breath hitched. She had spent a life being invisible. In the eyes of the man who had been taught to trust only steel, she saw for a sliver of a heartbeat the possibility of becoming visible, not as property, but as someone who could shape a life. Elena watched the exchange with a woman's gratitude that had no currency. Marco stood between them like a bridge being built. The house would not be healed in a night. The ledger would not be rewritten without debt. But in the small chamber where power and tenderness intersected, a fissure had been bridged, not by law, but by choice. Later, when the lamps had been banked and the house settled into the uneasy peace of people pretending that what had happened was within the realm of normal, Matteo found Sophia alone by the back stair. The air smelled faintly of lemon and gunpowder, and the house hummed with the exhaustion of men who had skirted catastrophe. "You will be paid for what you did," Matteo said, "not as a favor, but as a recalibration of debts. Not because I owe you, but because you have earned something I do not yet have words for." Sophia felt a strange new warmth spread like a rumor under her skin. "I asked for nothing," she said. "You asked with your body," he replied, and the certainty in his voice was softer now, less armor and more apology. "You stood where you had every reason to run." She watched his face, noticing the finer lines around eyes that had learned to squint against pain. For a man who had always given orders, he had just made a decision that required humility. Sophia understood at once that the Romano house had not been transformed by law or money tonight. It had been altered by a man who had chosen to see the human beneath the code. She reached for his hand, an impulsive thing that felt like theft and prayer at once. The contact was brief, but it rooted them both in a shared truth. Power could still be softened. Matteo did not pull away. The night closed with them standing like that, two people who had kept secrets and made choices that would echo. Elena's son was alive. The house had not exploded. The men would make their calculations in the morning. But something else had happened. A seed had been planted in soil that had been starved for tenderness. It would take time to know if it grew into forgiveness or another kind of claim. For now, Sophia felt the taste of it on her tongue, the sharp sweetness of an impossible mercy given room to breathe. Outside, the city slept fitfully. Inside, the Romano manor held its breath, waiting to see if compassion could survive the ledger, or if the old law of blood and retribution would reassert itself like rust reclaiming iron. For the first time in her life, Sophia felt that even if she were small, she could tilt a scale. And Matteo, who had built an empire on the certainty of edges, had learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do was to let a wound be tended rather than punished. Morning arrived slow and careful, as if the city itself was embarrassed to show up after last night's reckoning. The manor moved through its day with new, tentative choreography. Men still clipped commands like scissors through the rooms, but their sentences ended softer, as if someone had taught them a different grammar overnight. Matteo walked with the same measured step, but his shoulders no longer wore the unapproachable ridge of iron. They had been rounded by the weight of a choice he'd had to make, and the recognition that power without mercy made a brittle kingdom. Sophia found herself employed in different light. She still set plates and smoothed linens, but now those small, steady motions felt less like camouflage and more like tending. Matteo had given her a coin and a title that had no paper, a place at the periphery of decisions. Men who had once ignored her met her gaze and offered nods that held a new courtesy. Elena watched those acknowledgments like a woman seeing a child take a first step. Gratitude lived across her face in lines that deepened and softened at once. Marco lingered in the house as if testing whether the walls would accept him. He moved through the corridors with a polite curiosity that unsettled and charmed Matteo in equal measure. The boy, no, the man, said little at first, letting the household show him the habits of a life he had missed. When he spoke, it was with a bluntness that betrayed a life taught by necessity. And when he laughed, it was raw and sudden, like someone discovering muscle after long disuse. Elena clung to those sounds as if they were proof that the years of yearning had not been spent in vain. There were no grand reconciliations. No one expected miracles. Matteo gave Elena space to be both mother and political liability. Elena gave him her truth without pleading. Their conversations were practical and laced with the ache of what had been lost and what could not be reclaimed. Sometimes they spoke as two people negotiating a contract. Sometimes they were simply two people who had been kept apart by fear and were learning the syntax of apology. Sophia kept her copy of the list in a new drawer folded into a pocket of fabric that smelled faintly of lemon oil. It felt different now, less like a tool of rebellion and more like a ledger of choices she had lived through. She had not expected thanks. She had only wanted a small mercy to stretch one life a few extra heartbeats. The gratitude that came, as discreet as the press of a palm on her wrist and as dangerous as the look Matteo gave when he asked after her, was both balm and burden. Days passed in slow stitches. Velasco retreated, at least for a season, licking wounds and recalibrating his appetite. Enzo watched quietly, his allegiance shifting like iron in a furnace until it cooled into something less combustible. The house that had once folded itself around Matteo's will learned to keep a new rhythm. Respect mingled with a fragile kindness. Men who had only known how to take now learned, clumsily, how to keep. One evening, when the late sun hit the courtyard fountain and painted the marble gold, Matteo found Sophia sitting on the low stone wall watching water pull itself into circles. She had a smear of flour on her cheek and a softness in her posture that felt earned. He did not speak at first. Instead, he sat beside her like someone who had been learning how to be present without using commands. "You will not be invisible anymore," he said then, without ceremony. Sophia smiled, an expression he had not expected to see on her so calmly, and it lit the last place in him that feared softness. "I never wanted to be seen for what I could do for you," she replied. "I wanted to be seen for who I am." Matteo looked at her, not as a capo interrogating an asset, but as a man measuring a new kind of fidelity. He reached into his coat and, with an awkward tenderness, handed her a small brass key. It was a simple thing, a key to the ground room storeroom, where once only ledgers and weapons lived. Now it would hold flour and sugar, recipes his mother insisted on keeping, and a place where Sophia could, if she wished, keep a small chest of her own. "For a new kind of keeping," he said. She took the key like a covenant. It sang cold metal in her palm, but it warmed quickly against her skin. Elena watched from the kitchen doorway, hands pressed together as if in prayer. And Marco leaned against the doorframe, a half-smile tightening his mouth into something like belonging. That night, the house hummed with a careful peace. Men made quiet toasts. Elena sifted through a trunk of names and tucked away the ones that had done more harm than good. Marco sat at the head of a table not as a rival, but as a son, learning how to fold himself into family. Matteo moved among them with a new economy of distance, less a fortress than a home refining itself under pressure. Sophia imagined, in private, the small bakery in São Paulo she had once dreamed of, a place where dough rose in warm rhythms and the world outside could not intrude. It was a ridiculous thought and a ferocious one. The key in her pocket was no guarantee of a future that would be fair. It was merely the first real permission she had ever been given to belong. Outside, the city kept its crooked promises. Inside, at the heart of a house that had long revered rule above mercy, the water in the fountain turned over and over and caught the late light like an answered prayer. Sophia blew on the brass until it gleamed, then tucked it close. For the first time, she felt the shape of a life she might choose, and it did not call her to be small. Under the lemon-scented air and the watchful moon, the Romano manor held its breath, and then let it go. The ledger would always be there, inked with debts and favors, but tonight it shared space with something else. The possibility that love, small and obstinate, could tilt a scale and change the rules by which a family kept itself alive. The fountain kept circling, indifferent and patient, and the light found them all, at last, making peace with the parts of themselves they had believed irredeemable.